The email landed at 7:09 on a Thursday, and it wasn't signed by anyone. It came from the system. Your credentials have been suspended pending offboarding. Direct questions to IT service management. I stood at my counter with the kettle still climbing toward a boil and read it a second time, slower, the way you read a thing you already understand and are only confirming. Outside, the gray was just starting to lift off the parking structures. 8 years I'd spent at Ethelon Systems Group making sure a single signature stayed in the right place, on the right filing, my signature, on the one authorization that let a defense program worth $176 million exist at all. Sterling Dunmore had decided that signature was redundant. He'd decided I was redundant. He had no idea that the program didn't run on the org chart he'd just redrawn. It ran on me. The 44th floor of Ethelon's headquarters had a glass wall that looked west toward the river, and for years I'd kept my back to it. People assumed that meant I didn't care about the view. The truth was simpler. My work lived on the screen in front of me, not out the window, and the things I was responsible for didn't photograph well. You can take a picture of a finished aircraft. You cannot take a picture of the reason a foreign government agreed to let its components cross a border, or the filing that keeps a defense program legal, or the single name written into a clause that holds 9 other agreements in place. That work has no view. It has paperwork. And I'd spent 8 years learning every line of it the way you learn the inside of your own mouth without ever having to look. My name is Inessa Marchetti, and my title at Ethelon was Director of Program Compliance, which is one of those titles that sounds like a desk and a stamp and a person who says no a lot. What it actually meant was that I was the named human being standing between a multinational aerospace program and the regulatory machinery that could shut it down in an afternoon. In defense contracting, you don't get to build anything interesting until a great many serious people are convinced that the right person is accountable for it. Not the company. A person. A name on a filing. A signature on an attestation. A credential tied to one human who can be called, held responsible, and trusted. For the Sentinel program, Ethelon's Joint Surveillance Platform contract, the one that kept 400 people employed and $176 million of committed work flowing. That name was mine. I hadn't planned it that way. It had simply been the only way the thing could be built. 6 years earlier, when Ethelon won the bid that became Sentinel, the program depended on parts and subsystems that crossed 3 national borders before they ever became a single integrated platform. That meant export authorizations, foreign supply agreements, technical data controls, and a tangle of certifications that each demanded a named, vetted, individually accountable, responsible person. Not because regulators are sentimental, but because they'd watched too many contractors treat compliance as a corporate abstraction and then vanish behind a logo when something went wrong. The foreign partners felt the same. A French avionics supplier wouldn't release controlled technical data to Ethelon Systems Group. They'd release it to the person their own compliance office had cleared and named. A consortium of 2 component manufacturers, holding committed supply guarantees worth the structural core of the program, wrote a key personnel clause directly into their agreement. The supply commitment was tied to the continued involvement of the named operational guarantor, with the right to suspend the entire commitment if that person departed without an approved, vetted successor transition. That person was me. Down a list of 9 interlocking agreements, the master export authorization, the foreign supply guarantee, 2 certification filings, a liability attestation, a controlled data custody agreement, and 3 smaller bonds, my name appeared again and again, several of them cross-referencing each other so that if one lapsed, it tripped the next. I want to be clear that I didn't engineer this into a trap. I built it because it was the only architecture that would hold, and then I did the responsible thing. 18 months before any of what I'm about to tell you, I wrote it all down. A memo to the executive committee and to Sterling Dunmore himself, in plain language, flagging that the Sentinel program carried a significant key personnel dependency concentrated in a single role, and recommending we establish a formal, partner-approved succession plan so the company wouldn't be exposed if that role ever changed hands. I have the memo. I have the read receipt with Sterling's name on it. He replied with 3 words. Good, well managed. And then, like everything that didn't happen in a room with cameras or clients, he never thought about it again. That was Sterling. He was Ethelon's chief operating officer, and he was, in his way, very good at the parts of the job that could be seen. He could walk a 4-star customer through a hangar and make the man feel like the future was personally indebted to him. He could stand at a quarterly town hall and talk about operational excellence with such conviction that you almost forgot he had never, in his career, been the person on the filing. To Sterling, compliance was the cost of doing the real work. Plumbing. The thing you hire careful women to handle so that confident men don't have to think about it. For years, that arrangement suited us both. He took the stage. I held the structure. I didn't need the stage. I'd built something that ran, and watching it run, watching a controlled component leave to lose and arrive integrated and legal and on schedule, with no one ever knowing how many filings had to be perfect for that to happen, was a quiet kind of satisfaction I'd stopped expecting other people to understand. The trouble started the quarter Ethelon hired a new VP of restructuring. His name was Cassian Brandt, and he arrived from a strategy consultancy with a vocabulary instead of a history. He spoke fluently about delayering and rationalizing the operating model, and he had never personally kept a single regulated component moving across a single border in his life. He and Sterling recognized each other on sight. 2 men who shared the same conviction, which was that any function they didn't understand was probably a place where money was hiding. Brandt's mandate was to find savings in the post-award structure, and a defense program that has moved from bid to execution always looks, to a man with a spreadsheet and no scars, like it has too many people guarding doors that are already open. I felt the first tremor in a leadership review when Brandt put up a future state org chart, and I saw my function rendered as a small box, with a thin line drawn through it, folded into a generic program operations group reporting up to him. I raised my hand. How are the named responsible person obligations handled under this structure? The export authorization, the supplier key personnel clause, those are tied to a specific cleared individual, not a box. Brandt looked at me with the smooth, patient blankness of a man who has decided that anything he doesn't already understand must be someone else's overcomplication. That's exactly the kind of thing we'll clean up in transition, he said. Let's not get down into the weeds in a strategy session in ESSA. The weeds. $176 million of committed supply, the export authorization that made the entire program lawful, the controlled data agreements that 2 foreign governments had personally vetted. The weeds. I went back to my office. I pulled up the 9 agreements, and I read them again, slowly, start to finish, the way you reread something when you've started to suspect you're going to need to know it cold. The key personnel clause. The cross-default language, the successor approval requirements that existed precisely so this couldn't happen by accident, written by counterparties who'd been burned by exactly this kind of confident man before. I sat there a long time with the structure I'd built glowing on the screen, and I thought about that 3-word reply from 18 months ago. Good, well managed. They were going to remove the wall. And they had no idea it was load-bearing. The restructuring rolled out over 5 weeks, and Cassian Brandt ran it the way a man trims a hedge he has never once seen flower. He cut by the chart, not by the work. Anywhere a function looked like it overlapped with another, he kept the role with the louder advocate or the more impressive title and transitioned out the rest, with no apparent interest in which of the two actually understood the machine. I watched him do it to people I'd worked beside for years. A technical data control officer who knew the French custody requirements better than the French did, gone, her duties absorbed into a generalist who had never handled a controlled transfer in his life. A supplier relations lead whose personal standing was the only reason one of our component partners hadn't walked during a pricing dispute the year before, replaced by a box on a slide. Each cut looked immaculate in Brandt's deck. Each one quietly pulled a brick out of a wall he couldn't see and wouldn't have recognized if he had. I tried once more, through the side door. I requested a meeting with Brandt, and I brought a single sheet of paper. Not the 9 agreements, just a summary. The named guarantor obligations. The key personnel clause and its suspension trigger. The cross defaults. And a recommendation, in one clean paragraph, that any restructuring of the compliance function include a formal, counterparty-approved transition of the named roles before anyone holding those roles departed. I kept it short. I kept it free of jargon. I made it the kind of one-pager a consultant could read in a hallway. Brandt skimmed it for maybe 6 seconds. Inessa, this is honestly a perfect example of the complexity we're here to remove, he said, and slid the page back across the desk toward me with 2 fingers. If a single individual has made themselves a point of failure, that's not something we protect, that's something we engineer out. No one is irreplaceable. That kind of thinking is usually just empire building wearing a lab coat. He smiled, pleased with the line. Any contractual cleanup we'll handle through standard novation. Standard novation. As if you could novate a vetted, named responsible person filing without the regulator's consent. As if a French government compliance office would simply agree to swap me out for a box on Cassian Brandt's chart because Brandt had decided redundancy was a moral failing. He didn't know, couldn't have known, because he'd never read a single line of the actual agreements, that several of these contracts required the counterparty's written approval of any successor, and that the counterparties had named me specifically because they had watched contractors blow up continuity before, and had built in protection against precisely this man, in precisely this chair, making precisely this decision. I took my one-pager back. I didn't argue. I'd learned a long time ago that arguing with a man who has decided your complexity only deepens his certainty. The end came the way these things always seem to, at the worst possible moment, dressed as the most casual one. It was a Thursday leadership meeting, the large one. Maybe 18 people around the long table, Sterling Dunmore at the head, Brandt to his right. Brandt presented the target state, the finished hedge, every redundancy pruned, the operating model clean as a blueprint. My function wasn't a struck-through box anymore. It was simply gone. The compliance director role dissolved into Brandt's program operations group, my name nowhere on the chart at all. Sterling looked at the slide and something in him settled. The satisfaction of a man seeing the world arranged the way he'd always believed it should be. This is exactly what I've been asking for, he said. Lean, disciplined. No more guarding doors that are already open. Then he turned to me, and he did the thing he did, the thing that made him feel magnanimous and made the room feel comfortable and undid 18 months of careful warning in a single breath. Inessa, your work getting Sentinel certified was outstanding. Genuinely. But certification's a phase, and that phase is behind us. We don't need a full-time guardian for a program that's already cleared and running. A soft current of agreement moved around the table. It isn't personal. It's just that we're past the point of needing the overlap. And right now, candidly, that's what the role has become. The room did what rooms do. A man 2 seats down found something fascinating in his notebook. A woman across from me offered the small, sympathetic wince that cost the wincer nothing. Brant looked quietly satisfied, a gardener admiring a square corner. I felt the old heat climb my neck, and I let it pass through me and out, because underneath the humiliation, a colder, clearer voice had already begun to count. They are past the point of needing the person whose name holds the export authorization in place. They have decided the program is built. They have never once understood that I am not the guardian of the machine. I am a part of the machine. I understand, I said. My voice came out level. When's my last day? HR will work through the timeline, Brant answered, before Sterling could soften it. But effective immediately for systems access. That's standard at this level. I'm sure you understand. I did understand. Better than anyone in that room. Effective immediately for systems access meant that over the next few days, IT would run a routine offboarding script against my accounts, deactivate, revoke, remove the departed employee from every system, clean, procedural. And one of those accounts was not an employee login at all. It was the credential that was the named responsible person filing on a defense export authorization that 2 governments and $176 million of committed supply were quietly standing on. They were about to trigger 9 interlocking agreements by accident because a man who had never read the structure had decided the structure read itself. I gathered my things. No one stopped me. As I reached the door, I caught one face that wasn't studying its notebook. Dagny Holst, a junior analyst from my team, barely 2 years out of school, who had gone a furious shade of pink and was staring at Sterling like she wanted to set the table on fire. I gave her the smallest shake of my head. Not here. Not now. That evening, I sat in my apartment with a cup of tea going cold beside me, exactly the way the kettle had gone untouched the morning the system locked me out, and I made myself a decision I'd spend the next week being tested on. For 8 years, my entire job had been to catch the falling brick before anyone saw it slip. This time, I was going to take my hands away. Let me stop right here, because what I decided that night cut against everything I'd spent 8 years training into myself. My whole job, my whole sense of who I was, if I'm honest, had been to catch the thing before it fell, to fix it so quietly that no one ever knew there'd been a problem at all. And now I was choosing to fold my hands and watch the wall come down. So let me ask you truthfully, if you'd warned them twice in writing and been called overlap for it, would you pick up the phone a 3rd time? Would you save the people who just walked you out? Or would you let go the way I did? Tell me in the comments, because I genuinely want to know where you land. And if you've ever been the invisible one holding something up, stay with me and subscribe. What came apart that Tuesday is the part even I didn't fully see coming. The first call came on a Tuesday at 8:23 in the morning. Not to me, of course, because by then my phone had nothing to do with Ethelon. I only heard about it later, in fragments, and then in full, because within 4 days half the company would be telling me the story of the fire, as though I hadn't been the one who built the thing that burned. It started in Toulouse. Over the weekend, exactly as I'd known they would, Ethelon's IT team had run their standard offboarding script against my accounts. Deactivate credentials, revoke access, strip the departed employee from every connected system. Clean, routine, the kind of housekeeping Cassie and Brant would have described approvingly as engineering out a single point of failure. What no one in that process understood, because no one in that process had ever read the agreements, was that one of the systems they swept was the French-controlled data and export authorization portal, and my credential there was not a login. It was the named responsible person filing for the entire Sentinel export authorization. When IT revoked my access, the portal did precisely what it had been designed to do. It registered that the responsible person of record for Ethelon's export authorization had been removed, with no approved successor named, and it issued an automated notice to the French Compliance Authority and to the cleared foreign suppliers tied to the filing. The notice went out Monday night. By Tuesday morning, the Avionics Suppliers Compliance Office in Toulouse had called Ethelon's program desk to ask, reasonably, who the new responsible person was and where the successor transition paperwork could be found, because under the terms everyone but Ethelon seemed to understand, a controlled export authorization cannot sit without a named responsible person for more than 72 hours before the authorization is automatically suspended. Nobody at Ethelon knew what the caller was talking about. That's the part that still stops me, even now. The program didn't seize because of sabotage. It seized because when a foreign government's compliance office called about a responsible person transition, the Ethelon program desk had no idea such a thing existed, couldn't find anyone who did, and logged it as a supplier documentation query into Brandt's program operations group, where it sat in a queue for a day and a half while a 72-hour clock ran out, because the one person who would have understood the call before the woman in Toulouse finished her sentence was at home, drinking tea with her hands deliberately in her lap. I knew the shape of what was happening because I had drawn that shape myself, 18 months earlier, in a memo with a read receipt. Cross-default, I had written, in plain language. A significant key personnel dependency concentrated in a single role. I'd even recommended the fix. Good, well managed. When the export authorization went into suspension on Wednesday morning, it tripped the first cross-default. The component consortium, the two manufacturers holding that $176 million committed supply guarantee, had a clause tying their commitment to two things: Ethelon maintaining its export authorization in good standing, and the continued involvement of the named operational guarantor. Both triggers pulled in a single stroke. The consortium's contract managers, who were not emotional people, did exactly what the agreement entitled them to do. They issued a notice suspending the supply guarantee pending clarification, which in practical terms meant they stopped releasing committed components into Ethelon's integration line. That tripped the next one. The Controlled Data Custody Agreement, certified under my personal clearance, lapsed the moment the responsible person of record was gone and the authorization suspended, which meant the technical data already inside Ethelon's facility was suddenly in a controlled handling limbo no one on site was cleared to resolve. Which tripped the liability attestation because the program's coverage was contingent on the custody and authorization staying valid, and an underwriter will void a position faster than any other party in the chain. By Thursday, components were halted at the supplier docks, technical data was frozen in a custody status no one could legally touch. The program's coverage had gone dark, and every hour of it was generating penalty accruals, schedule slip charges, and increasingly frightened calls from the prime contractor whose entire platform timeline now ran through a program that had quietly locked solid. I learned the true scale of it on Thursday afternoon, when my personal phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail. It was Cassian Brandt. Inessa. Every trace of the smooth, patient blankness was gone from his voice. Inessa, hi. Listen, we've got a bit of a situation with the French side, some kind of documentation thing, and your name keeps coming up on the filings. The Toulouse people are saying you're the responsible person of record. I'm sure it's just a technicality, but nobody here can seem to. He stopped. I let the silence stretch and do its work. Can you come in? Today, ideally. We'd compensate you for your time, of course. I looked out my window at the gray afternoon. Somewhere out there, components sat motionless at a dock in France, and control data sat frozen in a vault no one on the floor was cleared to open, all because a man who had never read the structure had pulled a credential he didn't understand and didn't know which valve he'd closed. Cassian, I said. 18 months ago, I sent the executive committee and Sterling a memo identifying exactly this risk and recommending a transition plan. I have the read receipt. 5 weeks ago, I brought you a 1-page summary of the named guarantor obligations and the cross defaults, and you slid it back across your desk and told me you were here to remove complexity. I let that land. I'm not being difficult. I'm telling you that what you're describing isn't a technicality. It's the thing I warned you about, happening in exactly the order I said it would. There was a long pause on the line. What do we do? He said, quietly. 4 words, from a man who'd run out of vocabulary. That depends, I said, on whether the people who decided I was overlap still think so. They called the meeting for Thursday, 1 week to the day, after Sterling Dunmore had stood at the head of that table and called me overlap. There was a symmetry to it I hadn't arranged and couldn't quite stop noticing. This time, they sent a car. I want to be honest about how it felt to walk back into that building, because the easy version of this story has me sweeping in vindicated, and that isn't how it went. My badge still didn't work. Someone from facilities had to come down and walk me through the turnstile like a visitor, which on paper I now was. The program had been frozen for 3 days by then, and you could feel it the moment the elevator doors opened. That specific airlessness of a company where something enormous has gone wrong, and no one senior understands why. People I'd worked beside for 8 years looked up as I passed, and I watched the recalculation move across their faces in real time. The slow understanding that the woman they'd seen carry a box out a week ago might be the only person alive who could explain the fire. The conference room was the same one. Sterling at the head, Brant beside him, gray-faced and visibly unslept. 2 lawyers I didn't recognize, Fenwick and Rowe, by the leather folios. A woman from finance with a spreadsheet open and climbing on her laptop, and Marius Lefebvre, the head of operations, who looked like a man who had aged a full year in 72 hours. On the wall screen, and this was almost funny, was a live program status board. The Sentinel integration timeline, every milestone past Wednesday rendered in red, supplier nodes flashing suspended, a penalty accrual counter ticking upward in a corner like a meter in a taxi no one could stop. I sat down. I didn't bring the 9 agreements. I'd learned a long time ago that you don't put your leverage on the table. You put the consequences on the table, and you let everyone in the room do the arithmetic themselves. Sterling opened the way he opened everything. Warmth turned all the way up to paper over the cracks. Inessa, thank you for coming in. I know last week Look, restructurings are messy. Things get said in the moment, but I think we can all agree the priority right now is getting Sentinel back on its feet. We value your expertise. We always have. Let's start with the facts, I said, so that the part where you value my expertise has something underneath it to stand on. The finance woman's eyes flicked up from her screen. She, at least, had already grasped that we were not in a meeting about feelings. A week ago you terminated me, effective immediately for systems access, I said. Over the weekend, IT ran a standard offboarding against my accounts. One of those accounts was the French export authorization portal. My credential there wasn't a login, it was the named responsible person filing for Sentinel's entire export authorization. Revoking it sent an automated notice to the French authority that the responsible person of record had been removed with no approved successor. That started a 72-hour clock. Nobody here knew the clock existed, so nobody answered the call from Toulouse, so the authorization went into suspension Wednesday morning. I stood and I walked to the screen, to the field of red. The suspension tripped a cross default in the consortium's supply guarantee, $176 million of committed components, which named me as operational guarantor and tied itself to the authorization staying in good standing. 2 triggers, both pulled in one keystroke. They suspended the guarantee. That lapsed the controlled data custody agreement, certified under my clearance, which froze the technical data already on your floor. That voided the liability attestation, which depended on the custody status holding. I turned to face the room. 9 interlocking agreements, several of them cross-defaulting into each other, came down in sequence over 4 days, in exactly the order I described in a memo I sent this leadership 18 months ago. Every red node on that board is a brick from a wall I told you was load-bearing, and that you pulled out because a man who has never moved a controlled component across a border in his life drew it as a box with a line through it. Brant flinched. I hadn't said his name. I didn't need to. Sterling spread his hands, reaching for the charm that had carried him through every room he'd ever walked into. Inessa, hindsight's the easy part. The point now is the fix. You're the named person on all of this. So let's just reinstate you. You make the calls. You smooth it over with the partners. We get Sentinel moving again. Name your terms, title, compensation, whatever you need. We'll make it right. And there it was. The same move every one of these men reaches for at the very end. Name your terms. As though the only thing that had ever been wrong was that no one had offered me enough. Here's the trouble with just reinstate me, I said. Several of these agreements don't let you swap the responsible person at will. The counterparties named me specifically because they'd been burned by contractors before, and they require written, vetted approval of any successor. The French authority approves me. The consortium approves me. But after this week, neither of them is going to approve an ethalon that can terminate its named guarantor on a Thursday afternoon with no transition and not even realize what it broke. They don't need to trust a name. They need to trust the structure standing behind it. I looked directly at Sterling. Which means I am not coming back as your employee to be redrawn as a box and called overlap again the next time Cassian gets bored. If I fix this, I fix it as an independent compliance principle, under an agreement that names me as the responsible person the partners require, that cannot be terminated without a counterparty-approved transition, and that puts the named personnel structure under my control, not his. Ethalon pays for that structure. Ethalon does not get to vote it out of existence the next time it forgets what it's standing on. The finance woman had stopped typing entirely. Marius Lefebvre was nodding slowly, the nod of a man who has just heard the first sentence in 3 days that sounded like a door instead of a wall. Sterling's jaw worked. You're asking us to hand operational control of our core program authorizations to an outside contractor. I'm asking you to formalize what was already true, I said. Operational control of your core authorizations has rested with one person for 8 years. You just proved it, conclusively, by removing her and watching $176 million of committed supply freeze in 4 days. The only thing my proposal changes is that from now on, you'll know it, and you won't be able to break it again by accident on a Thursday. I sat back down. You called me overlap, Sterling. A frozen defense program and a penalty counter that hasn't stopped climbing since Wednesday is the price of that single word. I'd think very carefully before you reach for another one. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the soft tick of the accrual counter on the screen, climbing, and the red nodes pulsing exactly where they'd been. Sterling looked at the board, then at the lawyers, who said nothing, because there was nothing for them to say. Then, finally, at me. "What do you need to get Sentinel moving?" he said. "Not name your terms this time. Just the real question, stripped of every ounce of charm, the question of a man who has finally understood the true shape of the room he's sitting in." "My terms in writing first," I said. "Then I make the calls. In that order. I learned the hard way what happens at this company when the paperwork comes second." They signed by the end of the day. The Fenwick and Rowe lawyers fought it for about an hour first, the way lawyers do when there's nothing left to win and they need the room to see them earning their rate. They wanted a clause letting the board review the structure annually. They wanted to soften the counterparty approval requirement to something they could quietly root around later. And I let the screen on the wall make my argument for me. Every hour they negotiated, the penalty counter climbed, another supplier node went from amber to red, and Marius Lefebvre's phone buzzed with a prime contractor asking, again, when their platform timeline would stop bleeding. A little after 4, Sterling told the lawyers to stop in a flat voice I'd never heard him use in 8 years, and they signed the agreement that made me an independent compliance principal with control of the named personnel structure and a termination clause that no future reorganization could ever trip by accident again. Then I made the calls. It took 9 days to undo what 4 days had broken, which is the cruel arithmetic of these things. A wall comes down far faster than it goes back up. I called Toulouse first. The compliance officer there actually exhaled when she heard my voice, because she'd spent the better part of a week trying to explain to Ethelon's program desk a thing I understood before she'd finished her first sentence. I refiled as responsible person of record. This time under a structure that named me as the durable point of accountability the partners had always wanted. The export authorization came out of suspension. That untripped the consortium's cross-default, and the supply guarantee came back online. The data custody recertified. The liability attestation reinstated. 9 agreements restored in sequence, the cascade running backward now, brick by brick, until the wall stood again. The program moved. Not all of it came back. The penalty accruals and schedule slip charges ran well into the millions, and the prime contractor, having watched its platform timeline freeze for 9 days over what turned out to be an internal HR decision, quietly opened a second source review for the next award eye, which is the kind of thing that does not show up on this quarter's numbers, but costs a company dearly on the one after. Ethelon ate all of it. The total, I noted without ever saying it aloud, was a great deal larger than 8 years of my salary. Cassian Brandt was gone within the month. The board didn't call it a firing, boards never do, but a VP of restructuring whose structure review had frozen $176 million of committed supply and triggered a second source review on the flagship program does not survive the post-mortem, no matter how clean his slides were. I heard he landed at another firm, advising on operating model efficiency, and I felt something that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite satisfaction. Just a kind of tiredness at how reliably the men who break the structure fail upward into rooms with better lighting. Sterling kept his title. The board liked him in front of customers, and he was careful after that to stay a long way from anything resembling a filing. We settled into an odd, functional peace. He never apologized in words, but he stopped pretending the program ran itself, and once, months later, passing me in a corridor on the 44th floor, he paused and said, "You flagged it. I should have read the memo." Coming from a man like Sterling, that was nearly a confession, and I let it be enough because I'd stopped needing more than that a long time before. I run the structure from my own firm now. I hold the named responsible person role not only for Ethelon, but for 2 other defense and aerospace contractors who heard what happened and wanted the durable accountability the foreign authorities actually trust. The thing it turns out, the whole industry quietly depends on, and no org chart has ever once shown. I'm paid now for what I'm worth, which is another way of saying I'm paid for what it costs when I'm not there. Ethelon measured that number for me, by accident, in 4 days of frozen freight at a French dock. Dagny Holst, the junior analyst who'd gone furious pink on my behalf at that last Thursday meeting, came to work for me a few months later. She asked me once how I'd found the nerve to simply let it all come down, knowing the whole time that a single phone call could have stopped it. I told her the truth. For 8 years, I'd caught every brick before it hit the floor, and I'd done it so well that the people above me had come to believe, genuinely, that the wall held itself up. The only way to show them what I'd been carrying was to set it down and let them watch it fall. That was the hardest professional thing I have ever done. Not the rebuilding, the letting go. They'll call you overlap, I told her. They'll call you complexity, or a cost center, or a single point of failure they're proud to engineer out. Let them. Just make sure, quietly, on paper, in the places no one bothers to read, that your name is written where it actually matters. And then, the day they decide they don't need you, I shrugged. Don't reach out and catch it. Take your hands away. Let them see what you were holding the whole time. It's the only language some of them ever learned to read. The program runs now without anyone on the 44th floor thinking about why. Components leave to lose and arrive integrated and lawful and on schedule, and no one at Ethelon wonders what holds it together, which is exactly how it should be, because that is what invisible work is. But somewhere in 9 agreements, inside a structure no reorganization can ever vote away on a Thursday afternoon, my name is written into the wall, and everyone finally knows it's load-bearing.